welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 119, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
And me, Ravi Abbott.
And are you resting those DJ fingers over there, Ravi?
Well, I did a live stream, and apparently tonight I should be DJing with DJ Yoda, because this is out on Friday, so we'll see how that goes.
Tonight's a big night. Now, yeah, if you didn't hear about this on the show the other week, Ravi is going to be DJing with DJ Yoda, who's a pretty big, global name DJ, isn't he? He's very well known. And he's playing in our city here in Nottingham in the UK. Ravi's going to be warming up for him using two Commodore Amigas. Yeah,
let's hope they don't crash. Well, hope they don't crash at the same time, because it's quite nice when one crashes and you see that big guru error up on the
oh, the crowd are like, yeah,
guru.
Ravi's panicking in the background.
Yeah.
But you did actually a little live stream on Facebook. You were rehearsing for it. And yeah, I haven't seen you DJ on Amigas for about a year. And it blew my mind how good you were. I've got to say.
I practiced.
Yeah.
That's it. Practice makes perfect with these things. And I used to be able to DJ on other stuff, but now I've got used to the Amigas and all the little niggles with it, you know.
Yeah, the nuances.
Yeah.
But you got about 17,000 people watching as well, which is pretty nuts. So if you didn't watch that and you want to go back, it's on our Facebook page and check out Ravi's DJ set. About an hour and a half?
Yeah, hour and a half. I was meant to do an hour, but I got excited.
You played this banging remix of the Chaos Engine theme that I love.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing you DJ live. You're going to get the set on YouTube as well from the
Yeah, I'm
DJ
going to try. I'll probably put it on Facebook video because YouTube are massive at copyright infringement, but I'll put it up and see how long it is till they go, no.
You know what's crazy, though, is the fact that doing this podcast kind of opens the doors to doing stuff like warming up for DJ Yoda on Amigas. And every week we get to talk to people who really were behind video games that shaped our lives. And there is one company that we've had so many people asking for over the last 2 years. When are you going to do an episode about Bullfrog?
Totally. And Bullfrog, oh my God, the games that I played, Syndicate is my favourite game, full stop, is my favourite game. And oh, God, just Populous and Theme Park and
Magic Carpet.
I just so wanted that on the Amiga.
Yeah, well, there was a rumour that game was made on the Amiga but never came out, which, is going to be interesting to find out a bit more about this week. And, Magic Carpet for me, I remember vividly being at my grandma's house actually and watching Bad Influence on TV. And I've watched the episode again on YouTube since. But seeing the demo when they're flying around that landscape, and I remember looking at it I didn't know computers could do this.
To me, Magic Carpet was the equivalent of Mario 64 in being such a leap and a game changer in graphics and just presenting a world that people couldn't believe would happen.
Yeah, because I remember that can't be real. That must be a video or something. And the guy we've got as our special guest this week is Glenn Corpes. Now, Glenn, really Magic Carpet was his baby, really, wasn't it? He's a guy that kind of came up with the initial demo. And 1991 he started working on that game, and it went through a lot of iterations and changes.
Yeah, and he also co-created Populous with Peter Molyneux. So, he was there from the kind of beginnings and the roots of these God games as well.
Yeah, well, Populous was really, the first proper God game, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, and it was crazy in the kind of procedural generation and just how big it was, that world.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is going to be such an interesting one. I'm glad we finally got to do a Bullfrog show as well. 'Cause, looking through the list of games he was involved with, I'd forgotten just how many massive games Bullfrog had.
Yeah, we could have kept going, We could have done this retro 2 hours. Or
exactly. We got to the end of an hour. There's so much we haven't talked about, but, we might revisit it at some point in the future. Yeah. But you're going to really enjoy this week if you've got any fond memories of those Bullfrog games. Hang around. Glenn Corpes is our special guest on the Retro Hour podcast. He'll be on in around 15 minutes from now. Now, we would just like to say a big thank you to the people who allow us to come in here and do this show for you every week and bring you guests like Glenn Corpes. And that's people who make a donation into the running of the Retro Hour podcast. Now, we do say this every week. It's a tip jar. It's completely optional. If you like what we do and you want to help us out a little bit, that's all we're asking, really, isn't it? And if you can't, we understand.
That's it. We're essentially going spare any change.
Yeah. Have you got a little tin you can shake over there? Anything, yeah. So if you'd like to make a donation, we accept PayPal, or if you're into cryptocurrency, we have that on our front page of our website too. And just for making a donation of any amount, big or small, you will find your place in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. The most prestigious accolade in the world of retro gaming, I think it's fair to say.
At the moment, yeah.
Yeah, better than a golden joystick. So this week, making their place, thank you so much for your donation, Raymond DeVerd,
Craig Marshall,
Andrew M. Marsh,
and Stefan Blinks,
who all made donations into the running of the Retro Hour podcast, and you can do the same at theretrohour.com. And that is also the same place where we put the links to all of the stories that we talk about as well, because every week we kind of run through what's been happening in the world of retro for about 15 minutes before the interview. And, you don't have to look around for the links on the websites or anything like that, or Google them. We put them all in our show notes at theretrohour.com as well, including, it'll be the place where you can get a link to the Amiga Works documentary.
Yes, so the Amiga Works documentary was a Kickstarter that happened quite a few years ago, and it was fantastic. It's all about Alistair Brimble.
He was our first guest on the show, wasn't he?
Yeah, first guest on the show, and, I'm DJing with stuff, so I'm dropping some Brimble beats in there. And he was actually watching the live stream the other day.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah, which was just like, oh, my God.
We're not worthy.
We're not worthy, totally. And Paul Bridger, the guy who's behind this documentary, super fan, Alistair Brimble, super fan. He's selling out of Amiga Works, so he's kind of got this beautiful DVD that's all signed by Alistair Brimble, and it's got the full uncut version or the director's cut. So this is a lot longer than the original, and he's got around 20 copies available. And they're limited editions for around £20.
And we're in this, aren't we? We're in that documentary.
I think so. I haven't watched it yet. I've just got my DVD. Now I need to get a DVD player.
You are retro, right? You still got a VHS at home.
Yeah, that's it.
But I remember doing a bit for the documentary. And again, don't let that put you off the fact that we're in it, by the way. But having a tribute like this, this to me is everything that's great about the retro gaming community and retro computers and the internet in general, really. The fact that a guy like Paul, who's been a lifelong fan of someone like Alistair, got to meet him, talk to him, and actually took the time to make a whole documentary about this guy's work.
Yeah, it's so cool. I remember seeing Paul at Amiga 30, and he had the original tape that Alistair Brimble had kind of produced, with a photocopied cover and everything. It's so good.
And Alistair's such a lovely guy as well.
Oh, yeah.
And very talented. I mean, again, another one of these who, when he looked through the list of tracks that he did and games he worked on, it's like, if you missed that first episode, I will admit listening to episode 1 will probably be a bit cringeworthy for us. I don't want to ever listen to that show again, but skip forward to the interview. That bit's great with Alistair Brimble. So if you want to get hold of this documentary all about his work, it's called The Amiga Works, and we'll put a link in the show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, we've had a few tweets in the week at Retro Hour UK. If you want to follow us on Twitter, please do. People asking, so are you guys going to talk about Billy Mitchell?
Yeah, and this isn't the guy from EastEnders we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I was a bit confused at first. I was like,
yeah. So this is Billy Mitchell, and he's from The King of Kong, which was that very popular movie, actually. It's really quite high up in IMDb, and it's all about this battle for the top score of
Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong, yeah. So basically what's happened is there's always been people questioning these scores. Now, guys on YouTube did a massive analysis of Billy Mitchell's videos, because back in the days, before the internet, he'd submit VHSs of his score. So it shows the loading of the screen of Donkey Kong. And for a few frames, if you're using MAME, it loads in a different way to using the original arcade machine. And Billy's one seems to be loading in this manner of MAME. And he himself has stated he's never used MAME.
MAME's an emulator.
Yeah,
an emulator.
Yeah, he's never used it in his life. So this is kind of putting his scores into doubt. Now, this has grown and grown and grown over time, to the point that now Twin Galaxies, who were the official kind of scoring database, and they were the first as well, so they do get a lot of slack, Twin Galaxies, because they really kind of didn't know what they were doing. Nobody did.
Yeah, Walter made it up, essentially.
Yeah, they were collecting scores. So we've had Walter Day on the show, and he's talked about Billy and everything, but that was obviously not when this stuff's come out. Now, they've actually said that they've removed Billy Mitchell's score from his database and banned him from entering events. This is also based not solely on the video evidence, but it's also based on the emails of judges at the time that they have on their archives. So there's obviously more to this story than we know.
And he had a Guinness World Record that apparently has been stripped off as well.
Yeah.
Which, that's got a kind of sting, I guess. But he did release a statement, and it's only a minute long. So let's see what Billy has to say.
Hi, I'm Billy Mitchell. We're here at the Midwest Gaming Classic. I'm here with Old School Gamer magazine. I've been asked to address things that are recently in the media. The fact of the matter is, now there is a true professional due diligence being done to investigate things that happened as far as 35 years ago in a professional manner, not in a shock jock mentality designed to create hits. We will show that everything that has been done Everything was done professionally, according to the rules, according to the scoreboard, the integrity that was set up, not 2014 forward by the current regime who wants to reach back 35 years. Everything will be transparent. Everything will be available. I wish I had it in my hands right now. I wish I could hand it to you. But it's taken a considerable amount of time. Witnesses, documents, everything will be made available to you. Nothing will be withheld. You absolutely have my commitment to that. We've been at this since 1982, and it's not going to stop now.
It's a difficult one because, on the one hand, if there is any kind of wrongdoing there, then it's right that he's lost the title and everything like that. But I can also see it from his perspective. If there is kind of maybe something was misunderstood along the way, then that's got to really sting for him.
It kind of defines him, doesn't it? Because that's he's most famous for that. His whole style's based around that. Like, even when you watch the films like Pixels and stuff, there's these video game champions and they're kind of seen as these gods. So, yeah, it's a real hard one. I don't know what's going to happen. Let's see.
Well, it sounds like he's appealing it, doesn't it?
If he's appealing it, yeah. Let's see.
But you think of kind of, famous guys who are famous for this around the world. It is him and Steve Wiebe because of that documentary. And the fact that, everything in that film now, if it turns out to be false, it's kind of a bit of a lie, and that's upset the retro community quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, and also I think it's you've got YouTube and you've got like thousands and thousands of people recycling the same information and analysing it again and again and again, and it's I don't know, that pressure must be insane.
Nobody likes a cheater. I think that's what's annoyed a lot of people, if that is true. But, I mean, from what I've seen, he does have some legitimate high scores as well. So maybe stripping him of all his titles and banning him might be a bit over the top.
And that's the thing. And, he says this has been going on for a long time. Yeah. Even when we originally watched King of Kong, he would submit scores from away. He would have judges that only saw him do it. And, there was that kind of air of questioning his stuff, even then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know what his gameplay skills are like now. I know he does still compete, but, if he can go to a massive retro event and do a live demonstration and break that record again in front of people, then I guess he'd be redeemed.
I think some of the records, they're even saying, you can't achieve that score.
There'll hopefully be a conclusion soon, so we'll wait to see what Billy produces. Looks like he's working on something behind the scenes. And speaking of things that are ongoing at the moment, this is really exciting, though. One of my favourite games is getting an anniversary. Again, 25 years. It's celebrating. It seems like recently every game that we were into is celebrating like its 25th or like 30th anniversary.
It's showing that we're old, Dan. We're getting old.
Well, this is Myst. Now, we actually, again, we did an episode about this. We did a Myst episode about, a year ago now?
Yeah. Yeah, with Robin Miller and his brother Rand, isn't he? And they're the kind of creators of Myst.
And what a, groundbreaking game that was. Really, Myst was the main thing that sold CD-ROM drives back in the early 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was probably like the biggest title. And essentially it was like a kind of a slideshow with puzzle elements,
Yeah, very well done. But again, like you said, it was all like pre-rendered and everything, wasn't it? It kind of tricked the technology a little bit to make it seem more powerful than it was. But there are a lot of people that love Myst. And I'm one of these guys who, I enjoy playing Myst. The puzzles are a little bit complex. I must admit I have, looked up a few hint guides every now and then to get through the tougher bits. But just because, from a nostalgic reason, it was such a legendary game at the time, I'll always be very fond of it.
Well, it was also like a space we'd never been to. It was so shiny and 3D rendered and kind of never really explored anywhere like that before. And apart from when you were watching television shows and stuff like Nightmare was on and stuff, but you were never actually in there. Until you played Myst.
And it had that kind of similar atmosphere. Nightmare's probably quite a good comparison. It was kind of that, the lone person travelling through this like mystical fantasy world. Yeah. You did feel very isolated playing Myst. And it was all like very unusual and very surreal. And it wasn't a bit creepy in some parts. But I mean, I didn't realise quite how many Myst games there were because I played the original Myst. Riven obviously was a huge game, but there's Myst 3 Exile, Revelations, End of Ages, Real Myst. And now what they've done is Mr. Uru, yeah, and there's loads of them. And what they've done here is, to celebrate the 25th anniversary, there's been a Kickstarter running that was completely funded in 8 hours.
Yeah, and look how much has been funded.
It's about 8 times over what they wanted, yeah. 7,671 people have backed it, and it's still got 28 days to go at the time we're recording this show. But it is a limited edition, exclusive pack of all the Myst games you can only get through Kickstarter. And a few cool bonuses they've included too.
Yeah, so it's like 35 quid, and you basically get for digital download, all of the Mysts. But then if you're getting into the higher kind of areas of it, there's like physical DVD versions of all the boxes. But there's the Myst book.
Yeah.
Do you remember the book? You can get items from the kind of world of Myst. So there's the linking book here. There's the original designs from the sketches of Riven, and loads of different kind of bonuses. So depending how Myst mad you are, you can kind of get some good stuff.
Well, even stuff like an animated LCD linking book panel they're talking about in here as well. I mean, again, it's really a love letter to Myst, isn't it? Yeah. If you have got fond memories of that series and you love it, this is a real collector's item, and it's only available through Kickstarter as well. So if you want to get hold of that, there is still a bit of time to get involved. And it's just great that so many of our favourite games are suddenly getting this treatment all these years on.
Totally, I just need it in VR. I need that one in VR.
Myst would be amazing in VR, actually.
God, yeah,
I'd love that. Maybe next time. Now, before we get into this week's special guest, Glenn Corpes, talking about Bullfrog, some pretty big news in the world of Nintendo Switch this week.
Yeah, and I only showed this to Dan just now, and he was kind of absolutely amazed. The Nintendo Switch has been hacked, and people are running GameCube games and more things on it. Do you want to explain the process, Dan? Because this is pretty mental.
Yeah, well, they were always talking about the fact that you hacked your Wii U, didn't you?
Yeah, but I did a soft mod, which was just going on the browser and using a small little exploit that basically loaded it into different firmware.
And Nintendo were kind of giving up on that system. They didn't care about it. They never patched it. But I remember reading that, the Switch is not going to be hackable. They've patched all the holes in the software and everything. I don't think anyone expected them to find an exploit in the chipset. And apparently this is down to...
Which you can't fix.
Yeah, unless you get new hardware, essentially. But they're saying here, it's an exploit in NVIDIA's Tegra X1 processor. And that powers the Switch and also the Shield TV as well. So what it essentially does is, the way you do this is by shorting out one of the pins on the Joy-Con connectors. Now, the Joy-Cons are those kind of little detachable...
The things that go on the side, yeah.
Yeah, so you detach that, and some people actually made a little device that's 3D printed that you can clip onto the side of your Switch, and it will short out these pins, and then it'll kind of go into recovery mode. And that is where you can get into the system, essentially. And it does a DMA overflow.
That's crazy. So you're basically just making it go, no, and then go, okay, I'll accept this new firmware, or I'll accept this new piece of software that's not supposed to be on here.
It essentially thinks it's broken and you're trying to fix it, I guess. So, but now you've done this, they reckon it's going to be hard for Nintendo or NVIDIA to patch unless they make a new version of the hardware, which, they may well do at some point. But for now, it does mean that, there is kind of a console hacking and homebrew scene emerging for the Switch.
Well, I found the most interesting thing about it was, they say you need to short the pins. Yeah. Back in the days, people would be sticking spoons. They'd be sticking all sorts of kind of safety clips and, bits of nails and stuff. Now they're able to 3D print this hacking tool instantly. So it's called the Switch X Pro. You can download plans for it and just print your own at home.
Just don't plug it in the wrong way. Bang! It's funny, though, you mentioned that. I remember a friend of mine, to reboot his Commodore 64 because it had no reset switch. He'd get a screwdriver and just touch some of the pins on the user port and it'd reboot every time. I'm like, what are you doing? So I don't think I'll be trying this on my Switch just yet, but, it is interesting. It'd be cool to see what people end up doing with that, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if that voids the warranty or not.
I imagine it would if you had, scorch marks on your pin. I don't know how that happened. So we'll keep you up to date with that. And all of this week's stories, you can find them all at theretrohour.com. Right, then Ravi is going to get ready to do his big DJ set tonight. Look out for more news on that over the weekend. Hopefully we'll get a little clip up on YouTube of people raving to him.
Me falling off the stage.
Yeah, don't drink too much before you go, Ravi. Save that for the after party. And now then, should we talk about Bullfrog, legendary games, Populous, Syndicate, Magic Carpet, Powermonger, with this week's special guest, Glenn Corpes. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome this week's very special guest. Welcome to the show, Glenn Corpes. Thank you for coming on.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate you joining us.
Doing what I'm best at, remembering ancient history.
Well, we are going to get some stories about your time at Bullfrog, and Ravi, as I mentioned, huge fans of the games that you worked on. I mean, kind of going back to the beginning, what was kind of the thing that first got you interested in computers and games then? Where did that kind of start for you?
It was, I was quite old. I was 16 before I even saw a computer. I mean, and I must have seen video games before that. Yeah, a few years before that, there were Space Invaders machines at the skate park and stuff. And but the very first computer I saw was when I went to school to start the sixth form when I was 16. There was a couple of Commodore PETs around behind the physics lab, and the school wasn't teaching computers or anything, but I was allowed to play with them, which I did, and I did that to the detriment of my A levels. So yeah, I then went on from playing around with the PETs. I think they had an Acorn Atom as well, the pre-BBC one. For a bit. It was fun because that actually had graphics, but I think I only saw that at the very end of the sixth form.
Well, your first machine at home was a ZX81, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, which was that was interesting because I bought that from the very first advert, and when I got it home, it was 5 minutes later that I'd run out of memory, and I had to then sort of get another 50 quid, because the thing, I think it only cost 100, didn't it, Bill? 70 from a kit. Yeah, and I didn't make mine from a kit. So as soon as I bought it, I had to then scrounge another 50 quid off my parents to be able to actually do anything with it. Because the reality was, the first thing I tried to write was something which I'd done on the PET, which was a sort of Space Invaders base moving left and right, and as it moved to the right of the screen and you fired, it used up so much screen memory that it ran out of memory. And one day said exactly one.
So, what was your first break into the industry?
Well, when I left school, I didn't bother going to university because I rather arrogantly thought at 18 that I could get a job and I would be in a better position than I would have been 3 years later if I'd got a degree. Rather missing the point of going to university, I now realise. But so I set about trying to get a job. Ended up working for 4 years as a computer operator, and that was interesting in itself because it was on mainframes, and it meant that in about 1982, which I think slightly predates when Colossal Cave got onto the Spectrum, I played it on a SEL mini computer, the original mainframe version with you're standing by a grate in the ground and a stream rolls into the grate and all that. That original Crowther and Woods Colossal Cave was kind of cool. But after 4 years of working in that, I managed to get a programming job working on telex machines on old CPM things, which they were pretty outdated by 1986 anyway. And while I was doing that job, I met this guy called Kevin in a computer shop in Guildford, and he had an Amiga jacket on, and he was working for this company called Taurus that did this that was doing a relational database for the Amiga. I basically bugged him until I could get a job interview. And I went along, and of course that was the parent company of Bullfrog, and I met Peter Molyneux, and we talked about programming and stuff for about 2 hours, and then he said, "Well, we haven't got any vacancies because me and Kevin are the only programmers we need. Can you do anything else?" And I said, "Well, I can draw a bit." So he sat me down in front of D-Paint and said, "Draw a bit of wood." I can't draw anything. And I remember sort of sitting there with the blend tools because I'd kind of seen D-Paint before for 5 minutes, and I drew literally a plank of wood with wood grain on it or something, and I got a job as Bullfrog's first graphic artist, which was interesting. That was in late '87, so over 30 years ago now.
Well, what were the first titles you were working on there?
Well, the very first thing I did, and the day I turned up, was the load screen for a thing called A-Drum, which was kind of a proto-Amiga tracker. It was written by a guy called Andrew Bailey, who wrote Druid and Druid 2, and a friend of his was the salesman working for Taurus and a musician, and he's the guy that did the music and the sound on the first few Bullfrog games, and he used A-Drum as the composing software. I think some of the Amiga trackers even support it as a format, but it's a pretty obscure one. But the load screen for that was the first thing I did, and then the second game was a port of Druid 2 from C64 to Amiga, which we did with. So my first proper job was sitting with a Commodore 64 next to me, looking at the levels and copying the level editing into the level designs into the editor that Peter had written for the Amiga for Druid 2, and that was released by Firebird, and like as is the way with many games, we got a few £1,000 up front and never made any royalties, and then Peter went back to working on the database, and me and Kevin then wrote this thing called Fusion, which was sort of an 8-way scroller, mixture of puzzle game and shoot 'em up, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but didn't really work that well. And at that point, it seemed like there was, no one was giving me any work to do. So I was thinking, what am I going to do now? So I went home, dragged my ST in, and set about trying to port Fusion to it, only to find that what people said about the ST not being able to horizontally scroll was true, and it just wasn't going to happen. So at that point, I thought I was about to lose my job.
Well, you mentioned that then, because that's quite funny. I used to read about you in magazines as, like, the Atari ST guy at Bullfrog. You were kind of called a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, yeah. But what happened was, because I couldn't do the horizontal scrolling, I set about. I'd always been fascinated by the isometric graphics in Spin Dizzy. It had been my favourite game on the Amstrad CPC. So I just always wondered how the graphics worked. So I set about drawing a set of blocks, because if you look at something like Spin Dizzy or Populous, the blocks are basically a set of 16 blocks with each corner raised to a specific size, and then they're just tiled together in a way that makes ramps and pyramids and stuff. And I just thought I'll experiment, see how that actually works. And over the course, I think it was the August bank holiday in 1989, I just knocked up this demo. And because of these isometric blocks moving around, and because I had no way of getting any source data for the map, and I wasn't about to write an editor for it, so I thought, I'll write something which tries to generate a convincing-looking landscape out of it. So I wrote this thing and it just looked like a bunch of intersecting pyramids. But in fact, it looked like the start of a Populous level, as it turns out, because that is the same code that's shipped in the game. On the Tuesday morning, when people came back into work, I just showed it to everyone. I said, "Don't know what this is useful for, but I made this thing." And Peter got instantly excited about it, and went off into a room for about a week to play with it. It was pretty exciting, actually.
And I heard there was a Lego prototype as well. Was that part of the development?
The Lego prototype was that was Peter learning how to deal with the press. It wasn't even the first interview. It was probably when Ace were coming. It was definitely a magazine that we rated as being very important. And he just sent somebody down to a toy shop to buy some Lego, and then got them to make a Lego Populous landscape, and pictures of it appeared in the magazine, which was all very funny and stuff, except hid the fact that it was actually made from a prototype that I'd knocked up, which was a little bit galling at the time, but. Peter will admit that my version of the story is how it happened.
Populous became, such a big game and groundbreaking in so many ways. I mean, it's often credited as being the first kind of, real God game. So where did that kind of idea and concept of the game come from then?
But this is the thing which I really love about Populous, and it reminds me, a slightly arrogant way of putting it, but it reminds me of Rubik's Cube. Erno Rubik wasn't trying to make a puzzle. He was trying to make a weird piece of engineering where the corners, managed to hang on in a spooky way that, and it just turned out that once you stuck the stickers on, it turned out to be, possibly the best puzzle ever. And Populous was a similar thing. I was just messing around with this landscape. I didn't know what was going to happen. And very quickly, in that initial 3-day demo, when it was just a landscape which you could click on and modify, it sort of became obvious that flat land was going to become the currency. That was all Peter's doing, the way that actually worked out. But it kind of fell out of the system. It wasn't designed, and quite how we ended up there with this sort of indirect control. I suppose it's a bit different from other God games because it really was very indirect, the control.
Well, it's amazing how you could manage to fit such a huge world on one floppy disk, and the kind of generation of the landscapes led to having around 500 levels.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting thing as well because the game was basically multiplayer only for the longest time. I mean, we had a serial cable running between the ST and the Amiga, which we initially used for file transfers, because at the time we started it, you couldn't really read an ST disk on an Amiga, and you definitely couldn't read an Amiga disk on an ST. So we literally had like terminal programs sending files across this null modem cable, and we also used a null modem cable for playing Stunt Car Racer. Populous, the game, what we used to do was we'd work on it all day, and we'd stop work about 7 in the evening, and then we'd play it multiplayer for about 3 hours, and then Peter would use that to inform how the computer player should work. The gameplay was multiplayer only, and the single player game was a computer opponent that was designed to beat me, and there were a bunch of variables that you could set. Like you could say the computer's allowed to raise a lower land, do swamps, do earthquakes, do volcanoes, floods, whatever, and also the computer would have a speed, like how often it was allowed to think. So like on an easy level, it might only be allowed to think every 20 ticks of the game. On its hardest levels, it would be thinking every tick. So you literally had this thing that it's in Populous, in the release Populous. There's a mode called Custom Game, which hardly anyone would have ever played. But that was the only game that there was in it. But luckily, the producer at Electronic Arts was a guy called Joss Ellis, who'd also been the producer on the game we did for Firebird, on Druid. But when he was at Firebird, he'd also worked on the Sentinel. And I don't remember exactly it happening this way, because I was also a big Sentinel fan. Maybe me and Josh got talking about Sentinel, but we ended up sort of ripping off the way that the level progression worked in that. If you remember, in Sentinel, you'd sort of finish a level, and then the number of points you finished with was the number of levels you skipped. So there were 10,000 levels in the Sentinel. And Populous basically worked the same way. You'd skip some levels, and just like Sentinel, if you couldn't do the level you were on, you could go back and play the previous one by entering the code, and then finish it with more points, and you could skip the level that you just had trouble with. And exactly the same mechanism worked, and the file, there was just a text file with 500 lines in it of I think it was actually only 100 lines of different level settings, and each of those constituted 5 of the levels in the game. And that file was knocked together in about 2 days, including all the tuning, right at the last minute of the development. So if that hadn't got in, I don't know what people would have been playing, because they weren't playing it multiplayer and they weren't playing custom games. So that was another piece of luck on that game.
Yeah, because I was reading that there was a cheat that was made so that you could actually get to the end of Populous and see what the end was like, and then you realised that there was no end had actually been put in there.
I'm pretty sure there wasn't. No, you could basically, the names of the levels were the codes to get in, and you could kind of guess them, because it wasn't exactly done with crypto strength security. It was just sort of a sort of simple little checksum, and you could, and so you could probably play about 10 levels, guess what the parts of the level names were, and then try sticking a few of them together at random, and like you might get one that worked, So it was strange that you could get away with things like that. But the entire level progression was about 2 days' work. So there was no level design in it or anything. It was just a bunch of numbers to feed the fractal generator and stuff like that, and a bunch of flags to say which of the effects each you or the computer opponent were allowed to use.
Well, I mean, the game was received so well. I mean, people loved it. You had the expansion packs after that, and then that engine was used again in Powermonger in 1990, and that was, you had 3D vector graphics in that, didn't you? Was that like a big change from the original?
Yeah, well, that was basically the thing that I worked on next. It was we'd done Populous. Weirdly, we'd written it in C with a little bit of assembler for some of the screen routines, and then we sort of felt embarrassed about this and thought we'd better go to using pure assembler, like all the proper game developers did, which was kind of funny because it was probably about the same time that sensible people were moving to C, because machines had got that little bit faster. So Powermonger was the first pure assembler thing we did, and which meant we had a bit more power to play with, and also we took over the whole machine and trashed the operating system so that you could get all half meg to sort of stretch out in. And I mean, I loved working on that because it was the first bit of 3D rendering stuff that I'd done. Although it was kind of depressing to only be able to draw about 100 polygons before the thing dropped to an unusable frame rate. I never enjoyed playing Powermonger the way that I enjoyed playing Populous, but I was kind of proud of it as an achievement.
Yeah, it did kind of feel like it was pushing up to the hardware limits a bit, because you did get slowdowns in that game, didn't you?
Yeah, and there was some stuff on the game side of it that was just ridiculous. Like the size of the crowds of people. I mean, some of them could have like 150 people in, which is just insane. You've got like a 3D engine, on an 8 megahertz, 68,000, and then you're asking it to draw 200 sprites 150 sprites on top, and it's not. The thing would just slow down to about 1 or 2 frames a second.
Well, what new ideas did Populous 2 bring, and what did you want to expand after the original?
Populous 2 again was pure assembler, much quicker. Populous and Powermonger were very much ST first games. They didn't use the blitter on the Amiga, or they used it for clearing the screen, maybe, But Populous 2 actually was the only thing I ever wrote that was Amiga native code. So that meant the Amiga version was really quick, so it could do a full screen and it could do more layers of sprites. The other thing about Populous and Populous 2 is Populous, the original. The graphics were done by me, and the whole thing was done in 7 months by me and Peter, and that included. And during that time, I did the graphic engine and the ST port, and drew all the graphics except for the load screen. Populous 2 had 2 man years of graphic artist work in it, and huge banks of sprites, and instead of 6 or 7 effects, it had 36, I think, and it was just bigger in every way. I mean, it could also record games and play them back, and weird little things like that. Yeah, it was just a much bigger project. I mean, it took about 3 times longer, and had about 3 times the people working on it. Personally, I didn't like it as much as Populous 1, not to play, because it was too confusing and there were too many options. Like, you never quite knew if you were taking the right approach. There was something about the simplicity of the original Populous, but maybe that's just me. People do like being able to collect stuff.
Well, with the original Populous, I mean, it was ported to systems I would never imagine could handle it. Stuff like the Master System and the Game Boy, even. I mean, It's nuts that it could actually, be scaled down to an 8-bit system.
Yeah, the Game Boy one's incredible, because like the ST and Amiga had like at least half a meg of memory, and to get into the boring technicalities of it, there were 256 units on the screen in the game, which is obviously that's how many you can fit into a byte. So that those things could either be a person walking around, or a town, or a pair of people fighting, or whatever. And then occasionally a new one would be spawned somewhere, if there was a spare one. So the fact that they managed to fit that into 4K of RAM, there must have been an incredible amount of compression going on. But the thing about the Game Boy version, it is playable. I mean, I've finished the first level on it. But if you actually try and play the first level, by the time you get to the end of it, and that it's full of people, it's down to about 1 frame a second, because whatever it is it's having to. I mean, it should never have been released. There was even a NES version which works with even. I think the NES is the one with the 4K, and the Game Boy might have had 8, but the NES is way less powerful than a Game Boy, and that version was actually unreleased because it really didn't work. But the whole reason why there's a Game Boy version at all is because I was about the time we were working on Populous 2. I was in love with my Game Boy. I used to play Tetris on it all the time. And just for my own amusement, I knocked up a screenshot of what Populous might look like on a 160 by 144 screen. I think that's the resolution. In 4 shades of yellow to black. And I showed it to John Cook, who was the agent who went around the world getting different ports made. And he just said, "Give me that picture on a disc." So I did. And then about 2 weeks later, he came back in with... He got an EEPROM based Game Boy cartridge, which I've still got here somewhere. Which when you ran it, it just showed the screen that I'd drawn, and he'd basically taken it around places until he found somebody who said, who'd publish it. I think it was because those sort of a lot of the extra versions were done by a company called Imagineer rather than Electronic Arts, a Japanese company. and and it just got made and knocked up because I'd drawn this stupid picture. I also did one. I did a picture of what it might look like on the spectrum, but that never amounted to anything.
Well, one of my favourite games by Bullfrog was Syndicate, and Syndicate had this even more expansive kind of free roam and, a full living city. Where did the idea come around from?
Well, Syndicate was an interesting one because when I did Populous, it was Populous on an Amiga was just brute force drawing all the blocks, whereas the game that had inspired it, Spin Dizzy, was running on 8-bit systems, and it had a very clever system for updating just the bits of the screen that had changed. And that was kind of a clever bit of what it did. So, and I was sort of interested in how that might be used to do a scrolling, version of that kind of engine. So I made this demo of that on the ST, and it never amounted to anything. This would have been possibly before I started working on Powermonger. Well, probably while we were doing Populous as well. Yeah, originally there was another game in development which was going to be this thing with 4 scrolling windows where you had 4 agents that you would take around this level to do whatever, and it never really amounted to anything. In fact, that became Flood. Weirdly, It's not one of the more remembered Bullfrog games.
I heard that originally you had kind of 4 separate teams running on the map, and you could all play networked.
Suddenly that game became isometric, and it became one window, and it became the four guys in the team. But yeah, you're in much the same way that Populous had been multiplayer all through development. Syndicate was only multiplayer. I didn't really work on Syndicate because as a programmer, but I was sitting next to Sean as he did. I was working on the engine for Magic Carpet at the time. My only contribution, apart from the initial design of how the engine might work, was designing a few of the levels in Syndicate. But I did help playtest it a lot, and it was hugely popular. Every day there would be like 4-player games, and it was the only way of playing it. Every weekend there would be like people's friends would come in, and there would be like 48-hour Syndicate playing sessions. Real case of a game that everybody who was working on it loved, which I think shows in the final game. Oh. But weirdly, the final game was very much single player. The final game didn't even ship with multiplayer, I don't think.
I really love the storyline, the kind of idea that, people had chips in the back of their head and they were in this fake reality and the whole world was run by corporations. It was like very kind of a Night of the Living Dead mixed with cyberpunk kind of stuff. How did the story come around?
To be honest, I don't remember exactly. And I probably wasn't even cool enough to have read Neuromancer or anything by then. So that it was more about just a story that encompassed the reality of what was going on in the game, because the game was about controlling these guys and and adjusting their drug levels with these sliders. And then there was another big aspect of the game was going out in the street and controlling people. And then the chips in the head and I really don't know who came up with that, but it was very well done.
I remember they toned down the Nintendo version quite a lot. I think it was Green Blood that you got on it.
I think the German PC version and Amiga versions had Green Blood as well.
And finally on Syndicate, what was your favourite weapon? Mine was the laser that could fire across the map. That was insane.
Yeah, that was ridiculous, wasn't it? I quite like the fact that the I think it was called the Gauss gun. I don't know why that was. Could draw as many sprites as it could and still run at a reasonable frame rate. That was quite impressive. And I don't feel arrogant saying that because I wasn't involved in the technical side of the rendering on that one. So, but that was always nice because usually when there's a big pile of sprites in a Bullfrog game, it means that the frame rate's down to 3 frames a second. So that's not a very good reason, is it?
Well, I've been around that time. It must have been a very exciting place to work when you're having all these hit after hit, pretty much. What was the working atmosphere like at Bullfrog? Was it all work and no play, or what was it kind of like?
The interesting thing about the early days of Bullfrog is that it ramped up very, very slowly. I was arguably the first person working at Bullfrog, and I was the first person to have Bullfrog on my paychecks. But that's only because the people who were there before me had all worked for Taurus. But I think I was the 6th person. And by the time Syndicate was being done, we were still only about 30. was lots of working late for, but with no official overtime or anything. Everyone was just living it back then in the early days, and we also never took much in the way of external investment. It was always for the first. I'm going to have to do some maths on the years here, but from 87 till about 1991, 92, it was just a gradual build up, and each time we were getting a slightly smaller upfront from EA because we had money left from the previous game, so we were making a bit more money per copy and all that, all this kind of stuff. And then in about 94, 95, it got to the point where we weren't asking for any upfronts. And because of that, we were getting too much of a royalty. And that was when EA decided to buy Bullfrog. But even that didn't really change the culture. It was still very much Bullfrog. I mean, everybody in any kind of position of seniority in the company had worked their way up. By the time EA bought Bullfrog, there were like 6 teams making. There was a lot of games being made at the buyout time. So there was Dungeon Keeper, Syndicate Wars, Magic Carpet, Theme Hospital would have all been in development at once, and all of the people running those teams were all people that had worked their way up from. I mean, Sean Cooper started as a YTS kid when he was 17, and a lot of the other people running teams are people that had originally come in to do a conversion, or whatever. And it was very, very slow growing and organic, which meant it meant that the culture sort of survived, all the way up until Peter left in about 99, really, 98, I guess.
Well, I think, Peter did a very good job of being the front man of Bullfrog, and he'd always see him in the magazines and TV shows. And I know there's kind of a bit of a divisive opinion of Peter online these days, but what was a man really like to work with? How did you find working with Peter?
It was great working with him in the early days. I mean, when the company was tiny, it was small. It was my entire, like I say, Populous was done on a bank holiday weekend when I went into work because I had nothing better to do, and my social life was largely involved. I mean, whatever parties were happening at Peter's house and stuff back then. We were really close mates, but we kind of drifted apart quite early on because I ended up getting a girlfriend and then a wife, and it was very much young nerds doing it, with nothing better to do. That was the culture at Bullfrog for the longest time. Peter liked it that way because it worked, because it was massively passionate about the stuff he was working on. And he was also, the other thing that people probably don't realise about Peter is he was a great programmer. I mean, it was kind of interesting for me because I'd been playing around with game-related stuff before, sort of drawing blocks and sprites on the screen and things, right from the days of 8-bit computers. And Peter had actually written a game, but he didn't know the idea that the screen was just memory wasn't the level that he thought, and he was much higher level programming, thinking, and he was just able to get stuff done in a way that I think a lot of other, more sort of to the metal hacker types just wouldn't do. But and he was instrumental on the programming right up until probably Theme Park and maybe a bit of Dungeon Keeper. But after a certain time, when the company got to a certain size, he kind of had to stop, and by then things were a little bit different. I mean, and also Peter and I mean, we sort of fell out at one point. I mean, when he left Bullfrog, I remember. But did an interview for Edge magazine, and somebody said, "Oh, how's Bullfrog going to survive without Peter?" And I said, "Well, actually, he wasn't really involved in Syndicate or Magic Carpet," and he got really, really pissed off about that. Not because it wasn't true, but because But what Peter did is he would be, the reason he wasn't involved in Syndicate is because he was working flat out on Populous 2 and then Theme Park during that time. And the reason he wasn't involved with Magic Carpet is because he was working on Theme Park and Dungeon Keeper while it was being developed. I mean, he was he was focused on one game at a time. And the cool thing that he did is he let other people like me and Sean and others just get on with what we were doing. And but he didn't like me pointing that out at one stage. Although we got over that some years later.
Well, you did mention Theme Park in there a couple of times, and obviously I remember that coming out, and it was such a huge title for Bullfrog. I mean, did you have much involvement in Theme Park, and what did you think of it?
No, I was working on Magic Carpet for almost all the time that was in development, because it was exciting. 256 colour. Every pixel on the screen is just a byte of memory. That was lovely. It was so fantastic after having to mess around with bit planes and for pixels and on the Amiga. So for Theme Park, my involvement was, I think I was kind of involved with the sprite routine a little bit, but I was never involved with any of the gameplay elements of it at all.
Eventually Roller Coaster Tycoon kind of took its thunder a bit, I guess, didn't it? I mean, there was an obvious influence there from Theme Park, I think. But why didn't they develop Theme Park further, and why did they let Roller Coaster Tycoon take over, I guess?
Well, that was an interest. When I left Bullfrog in '99, and my new company was called Lost Toys. Probably not very memorable, but we did do it. I think the best game I ever did was done by Lost Toys, but that's a separate story. But we were the art director at Lost Toys. Darren had been the art director on Theme Park World, which was the second Theme Park game, and it still hadn't been finished or released after he left. So it would have been like ECTS '99. We were out there trying to pitch our games to publishers, and we walked up to the EA stand, and there was somebody. And this is like on the sort of the day before it's open to the public, so it was pretty quiet in there. We walked up to the EA stand, and there was somebody showing Theme Park World, which Darren had been the lead artist, the art director on, only 6 months earlier. And then some lawyers turned up. And said, "This is a bit like Roller Coaster Tycoon." And 3 of us ex-Bullfrog people who weren't actually no longer working for EA turned around and told them that Roller Coaster Tycoon was just a Theme Park rip-off anyway, which was quite fun, because we wouldn't have been able to do that probably if we'd have been still working for EA. But and there's some really, it's interesting, because I mean obviously, I can understand why people might like Roller Coaster Tycoon better. It was more focused on the roller coasters, which is kind of what you want. But some of the things that they did the same were pretty audacious. Like on Theme Park, the name of the ride, because you could name your own ride, would scroll through a little window on the ticket booth, and they did exactly the same thing. It was just, it's amazing what you can get away with ripping off gameplay in games, But rip off the name or get the graphics too close, and you can get in trouble. But
everything else, you're all right.
If it's the game mechanics, they seem to be effectively unprotectable, which is I've always thought was interesting with games.
You mentioned Magic Carpet there. How long was Magic Carpet actually in development then? Because I didn't know it was developed that early.
When we moved from Amiga first development to PC, I immediately started playing around with that 256 colour mode. So when would that have been? It would have been just after Populous 2 was finished. And so I was basically playing around with polygon rendering, and which then turned into sort of Gurad shaded polygon rendering, and then I saw some screenshots of early pictures of Ultima Underworld, and I realised that texture mapping was sort of just Gurad shading in 2D, and so I was playing with this thing in the background for a long time, but probably not that, maybe 2 or 3 years, but it seemed like a long time at the time, and then suddenly. I think Doom had come out, and EA and Bullfrog, wanted an action game, and we had this. And at that point, Magic Carpet was kind of it was just like a thing you could fly around with, a nice fractal landscape and interestingly applied textures, and no idea of what the game was going to be. All we knew is we didn't want to do a flight sim because nobody was that into flight sims. Somebody said we come up with the idea of a Magic Carpet, which seemed fine, because the reason we weren't into flight simulators is because, from my perspective, you were just always looking at like a blue sky over a green or blue or brown base bit and shooting dots in on the horizon, and it just seemed like a waste of the technology. So we wanted to think of something that would be where you would be able to see what you were fighting and be closer to the ground. And somehow a Magic Carpet became the thing. The thing about Magic Carpet that I always find myself saying, so I might as well say it again now, is I'm very embarrassed by how close the fog was in it. I'm now going to explain why that wasn't my fault, which is going to make me look very petty. But when I was originally working on it, when it was my project, and I was just me and an artist experimenting, the cells of the landscape, the tiles were about 10 meters across, and you could see 20 tiles to the horizon, so you could see about 200 meters. So it's not very far, but it's kind of okay. But then somebody came up with the smart idea of building castles out of the landscape. In doing so, they redefined the size of one of the squares of the landscape as being about 2 meters. So suddenly you could only see 40 meters, and instead of 200. So that extreme fog isn't my fault, but fixing it by drawing another few thousand polygons wasn't an option back then. I mean, the fact that it was drawing 800 polygons and a bunch of scaled sprites at a decent frame rate wasn't a bad achievement at the time.
I remember seeing it first. I think it was on like Bad Influence on TV, and they did a demo of it, and it blew my socks off when I saw it. And then I remember, because I had you remember the Amiga CD console, the CD32?
Ah, yeah.
I had that, and then I saw it was going to be released on the CD32. It said in the magazines, and then it just never came out. I mean, was that like a technical issue? Do you know? Or
well, this is it's funny that you should ask about this, because if you Google the Amiga CD32 Magic Carpet, and but I'll tell you what happened. I found a forum somewhere where people were asking exactly the question that you just asked, and they had pictures of the Amiga version, and they showed a guy on a carpet, because Magic Carpet was first person, so this was a third person game, and it had a sort of skeleton dragon thing flying around, and those graphics, they were from an early version. Because what happened with Magic Carpet is I was messing around with it for a couple of years, and then suddenly they wanted to get it out early and get it out quickly. And Sean Cooper wrote the game. He took what I had and finished it in about 7 months flat. And before that, I'd been playing around with this thing for a couple of years, and the version that was billed in those photos as being CD32 was actually an old PC version. Now, what I think happened was that during that time, we would have still been talking to the Amiga magazines, because they'd been very good to us. And what I think happened, a long time ago, is that when a magazine was visiting us to talk about these ports, they were also shown around the rest of the office, and they saw Magic Carpet running on a PC and would have asked the question, is this coming out on the Amiga? Somebody implied that it would. Now, it might well have been me, because I can remember getting quite excited about the CD32. Earlier on, I mentioned about how the 256 colour mode made things much easier for texture mapping, and those sort of things were really difficult on the Amiga, if possible at all. So the rumour was circulating that the CD32 would have a byte per pixel mode. So I probably would have said to them, this could be done not on the Amiga, but maybe on the CD32. As it happens, the CD32 actually wasn't powerful enough for something like Magic Carpet, which really required like a 33 megahertz 486. So there's no way that even what was a CD32? It was like a 12 megahertz 68020 or something. Yeah, I don't remember. But it was like an Amiga 1200, wasn't it? But with this extra chunky to planar conversion chip that might have allowed a byte per pixel mode. So basically, it was an outright lie told to an Amiga magazine to keep them interested. But I found this forum where somebody was asking the same questions, and I joined the forum so I could reply to it, and people were still arguing with me about whether it ever existed. But if you Google Magic Carpet CD32, you'll find the screenshots and probably the thread. I mean, I've refound the thread. It was a conversation I had about 5 years ago. But but sadly, it wasn't ever going to happen.
Well, I'm glad you put that rumour to bed, because I've been wondering that for about 25 years. So.
Still people waiting for the unreleased copy.
Well, yeah, exactly. There were 5 years ago. And when I was saying that, it wasn't ever going to happen, and they didn't want to believe it. It's funny.
Well, let's get towards the late 90s. Why did Peter leave, and what was it like after he left?
Oh, that's basically Peter had left. It kind of left Bullfrog to finish Dungeon Keeper. I was involved with Dungeon Keeper at the beginning. I mean, I wrote the graphic engine for it, but it took a long time. I mean, after about 2 years, it was started again, but the engine wasn't rewritten. It was just that the game was started again because Peter hadn't been very involved because EA had just bought Bullfrog. Peter was kind of involved with EA worldwide and spent a lot of time in the States and Canada. Then he sort of came back and was like, "Oh, this game isn't going like well. I wanted to go. I'm restarting it." I think it all got talked about, in the magazines at the time. And by the time he finished it, a couple of years later, he'd moved the team out to his house, and he decided that he wanted to leave. So I really don't know because by then I hadn't really seen much of him because like I say he wasn't in the building, and when he left, EA they possibly didn't appreciate exactly what he did, which I would categorize as focusing on one game while leaving the rest of the company to do its thing, which produced the others, and he was replaced by a lot of people from outside. They put various managers in at various different. This would have been about 97, and I'd been the head of R&D, which basically meant the engine department. And at that point, I found myself interviewing a guy who was going to be my boss. So I decided to move sideways and start a game team. I was working on a game called Indestructibles, or it was actually the second incarnation of Indestructibles. It was going to be this superhero game. It was featured in magazines a few times, but that got cancelled anyway a few years later. But when he left, the company, it really sort of changed, and then there was like an exodus of most of the good people. So Peter left to form Lionhead, and then a load of other people left to form Lionhead satellite companies. Like if you remember, the company that did Fable used to be Big Blue Box. Mm-hmm. It was Dean and Simon Carter's company. It wasn't actually part of Lionhead originally. It was a Lionhead satellite company that eventually folded into it. But also there was Muckyfoot. There was a load of other senior Bullfrog people left for. So it got to early '99. All of my mates, all the people that I'd had a lot of respect for had left. I mean, it just seemed like the thing to do. And we had some ideas, and I had some good people that I teamed up with, and we left to form Lost Toys.
Well, that must have felt a bit like the end of an era then after all that time there.
Well, yeah, it did a bit, but we were still in Guildford and we were still seeing the same people in the same pubs. It was just more like that's how it was. And it's so funny to think that it was 99. It's nearly 20 years ago now. What had happened as well at EA is that a lot of things had got canned. A lot of the theme prison and theme resort had been canned, and this game called Void Star that was going to be this sort of this epic space shooter had been canned, and Indestructibles, this superhero simulator, had been canned, and they were all done for weird reasons, because we were now getting interference from EA we hadn't seen before. I mean, Indestructibles was a really interesting one because it was my project ostensibly, and there were designers and things who were involved with it too, and the idea was going to be that you're patrolling you're a superhero patrolling your city, and it was going to all be about knowing your way around the rooftops, and you would have some kind of sense that would tell you that there was a battle going on over here, there was a crime going on over here, so you'd be able to sort of get there quickly. And you couldn't actually fly in it, but you could climb really quickly and glide, and it was just a really nice mechanic, and we had it working multiplayer, but only sort of stupid little test demos. There was a game where you could shoot fireballs at this model of a Volkswagen camper that we'd stuck in. We basically got a football field from the guys downstairs who were working on some FIFA game, and this Volkswagen camper model that we got from some online library. And you could just run around shooting fireballs at it and trying to get it into the goal. But because the game wasn't really finished, what would happen is sometimes it would fall off the side of the pitch, and then everybody who was playing it would have to go down and then get underneath it and lift it up. Because that's the cool thing about doing games multiplayer first, is that they don't have to actually work. As long as everyone's got the same rules, they become fair. Somebody from EA in the States got very excited about it, saying this could be our Quake. Sort of a few weeks later than that, somebody else from EA said, why are you doing a superhero game and you haven't spoken to Marvel? What are you thinking? So one of the guys contacted Marvel. We got a reply from them saying, we're not really interested. And by the way, here's our list of 2,000 superheroes that are part of the Marvel universe. Don't make any of your characters too much like any of these. And shortly after that, the project was canned, and we were asked to sort of to tread water while they decided what they were going to do with it. And that was when I flounced out to do Lost Toys, which was arguably quite a bad move. But, yeah.
Well, Glenn, today you are still involved in the games industry. I know you've been working with mobile games and actual reality. I mean, what are you working on now, and what's coming up from you?
There was a game that we did at Bullfrog called High Octane. That was this lovely driving game that was made out of an early version of the Dungeon Keeper engine. That later it got kind of ruined at the end because it became too much about shooting and power ups and less about the driving mechanic. So I did a mobile game called Ground Effect that was basically a rewrite of that, which I was kind of proud of, which didn't do that well. And then about more recently, I did a thing called Topia World Builder, which has actually had 500,000 paid downloads, and is sort of a Populous-like game with a modifiable landscape and set on a sphere, rather like Populous: The Beginning, which is the third Populous game. And more recently, I've been working on this game called Fat Owl with a Jetpack, which for some reason has taken me 3 years, and took me 3 years to get to the point where it wasn't even half finished. It was supposed to be a really simple, quick game. It's a 2-button controlled game, kind of aimed at mobile, with an aesthetic based on some sneaky shader use, so that it's sort of simplistic graphics, but the idea is everything looks like it's cut out cardboard with drop shadows around it. Looks sort of like South Park, actually. All the paper and card is shiny and textured. But I never quite finished it because I shouldn't really be working on games on my own, and I realised, and much too recently. And then last summer, my son finished an animation degree, and we worked on a game together, which is called Powered Up, which is it's an AR game for iOS, and that's Powered Up, POWARDUP, which is a really stupid name because people don't say it right, and then that was fun to work on, and it was and we did it very quickly. Like we got it out in 2 or 3 months, and it's written in Swift, which is Apple's new language, which is a really nice language to work with, and it was a revelation for me because I hadn't learned a new language for about 20 years. And since then, I've been doing contracting work in AR, and I'm now working mostly on a VR, an Unreal-based VR modeling package, which is interesting. And very recently, like in the last week, I've started writing something in Unreal because there's a new game, and I'm going to try and make it work, kind of like Populous did in the first place. Which is it's a different take on flatland as a currency. Rather than trying to develop it into a game on my own, I'm going to get it to the stage where that stuff's working, and then try and find someone else to help me turn it into a game. And there are some candidates for that. But it's kind of become very clear to me in the last year that I shouldn't be even trying to work on my own because it doesn't really work. Yeah, I'm thinking of calling it Populous, but spelt with an ACE instead of OUS. I think EA would let me get away.
You can but try.
It's probably too close, yeah.
Well, Glenn, I can't believe the amount of incredible games and legendary titles that we've talked about in like just under an hour there. That's been, insane how much incredible games you've been involved with. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing the inside stories of some of our favourite games. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's been fun.